quite excited about this week's supplement because it's one of the more in-depth pieces I've been able to write this year, and as usual it's been prompted by looking something up that I keep seeing all the time that in my gut I feel and I know is wrong. There are certain explanations and reasons that just get propagated for things without real and true research apart from anything else, and this week I'm going to bust one of those myths, as I sometimes try to do. Not really because I enjoy busting myths, but I do enjoy getting to the truth. So if you've ever watched one of these before or listened to one, you'll know that I like to start with a quote, and this week's is, "Here's a secret, all guesses are educated guesses because there is almost no estimate you could make about which you literally know nothing." And that's from Annie Duke, the professional poker player. So before I get started, I just wanted to give a shout out for the next property business workshop that I'll be running alongside Rod Turner, Tuesday 1st of October, covering exits with two main objectives. Firstly, planning your own exit, which people do very poorly in our experience. And secondly, so that you can understand other people's exit plans or lack of them and assist with them when looking to buy a portfolio or a business, helping vendors get what they want, need and deserve, and working towards true win-win situations. As always, it will be an action-packed, content-filled day, which will stand alone in helping to advance your understanding as a property business owner. So the link is live. There are still some early bird tickets left. We've got about another week left of early bird sales, and that's at bit.ly/PBWFOUR. So welcome to the supplement proper. Do you want me to tell you how many supplements there are left until Christmas just now, or is it still too early for that? Right, lots to discuss this week. In a deep dive, I take a further look at some alternative analysis following on from last week's deep dive, showing two problems for the wider rental market as a whole. Firstly, ex-landlords selling in larger numbers than ever before, and secondly, new entrants not joining the market. There's a relevant report which caught my eye from the Home Builders Federation, which is called Broken Ladder, which I also think is worth analysing and adds to the same debate. But with respect to the standard format, I'm going to press on with the real-time market analysis, and as always, I'm going to give a shout out to Chris Watkin, who delivers these week in, week out, with some bonus content too sometimes. The listings are still ploughing on, 29,200 across the UK, and it was only that low because of the truncated week thanks to the bank holiday. Remember, because we're 1 week behind on these, but 1 week is very, very real-time compared to most stats in property. Agents are preparing for the September rush. Continually seem to be maintaining that difference, 7.5% more listings than the average year before the pandemic. Net sales are still also outperforming in the same way, 32% higher than the equivalent week last year, and just over 15% higher than the pre-pandemic market for the same week. August sales agreed prices dropped a little bit on a per square foot basis from July. I had a chat with Chris recently on these. He started recently to exclude particularly expensive properties, which makes a lot of sense because they can distort the data. Even though there aren't many of them, often there are just so many square feet involved in the luxury market that one mega house might represent 10, 20 or even more typical houses in square feet terms, and so these stats are settling down a bit. But what's coming out the data now is a 0.9% drop between July and August. This wouldn't be a massive surprise. This is why seasonal adjustments normally happen. And a 1.22% price drop from April, which calms things down significantly in the forecast for this year in terms of pricing. However, in support of prices, of which I still believe in my predictions for 2024, the pricing in mortgages bit and rose since April until much more recent drops. So I think those will probably filter through in September's market as it also rises seasonally. So cheaper mortgages from 6 months ago, but also the market picking up after a summer lull, although it wasn't as much of a lull as we normally see. Listing prices have come right back up. I'm not sure if there's much more to this than the agents as a rule, knowing they need to list very keenly in August, but can afford to be more punchy in September. It appears that more and more that cheaper properties are selling more in proportion since June, which was a trend that also occurred in 2023. That tends to occur for the rest of the year, by the way. Price reductions are at nearly 1 in every 10 properties per month, which is not high by historical standards, and stock levels are very, very high indeed, 710,000 houses on the market around the UK. July had more on the market, but this number is between 50 and 100,000 more or between 7 and 14% more than the bellwether of this pre-pandemic 2017 to 2019 market. So it's still significant, and that tells the biggest story really of the current market. Houses are selling, but they need to be fairly priced and have something to make them stand out. So drilling down one more level, cheaper houses are selling well, or relatively well, in what's a relatively functional market. Expensive or top-end stock continues to perform in its own sort of bubble. Mid-market stock is not so easy to move. If it's not a first-time buyer penalty kick, it's sticky unless you really want to compete on price. Okay, so it's time to be so macro. This week we had finalised PMI numbers. The BBA mortgage rate took an unexpected turn. The wisdom of Halifax and their house price index, and yes, we're not going to move from the gilt and swap yields until our PTSD is completely gone, which I've got penciled in for some time after 2030. That's post-trust stress disorder, if you wondered. Thanks for asking. So the PMIs, the full suite of finalised numbers this week for August. I love these, as you'll know if you've listened before, because they're fast and they correlate so well to what ends up going on in the economy. The S&P numbers have a fabulous track record of correlation with GDP growth. Manufacturing for once was spot on the consensus. 52.5, a healthy print in a country constantly beleaguered for its manufacturing industry. The post-COVID slump looks over. Services increased a little compared to the expected and flash numbers, up to 53.7 instead of 53.3. Construction was down to 53.6. Still very positive, but lower than the consensus of 54.9. The composite index at 53.8 was dragged up by the services print and is a really healthy number for an August in general, and Q2's economic success looks reasonably well assured at this point. I do fear that October's budget will weigh on business confidence in September because of the way that Starmer has framed it more than anything else, but perhaps that's just a personal concern. I do know that plenty share it that won't bother bigger businesses at all. Let's see. I'm going to lead with the construction numbers in this segment because for the first time in many reports, the first subheading is positive about housing activity. They lead with solid output growth maintained across the UK construction sector in August, and then housing activity rises at the quickest pace since September 2022. It's amazing how many comparisons there are to the around lettuce era, even though it was so short. The headline in the FT this week proudly trumpeted that mortgages have finally dropped back to the rates when Liz Truss took charge. Okay, last mention of her this week, I promise. Well, probably. Anyway. One of the other strap lines in the report is that business optimism remains relatively upbeat. After a mega print last month, which was 55.3 for construction, consensus was this figure would stay a bit higher, but 53.6 is still comfortably positive. Now, in spite of the positive positioning in the headlines, because it was the largest relative improvement, commercial activity still remains the best performing segment, whereas civils expanded at a notably weaker pace than in July. Resi gained momentum, with the 52.7 individual metric for the resi sector being the best for nearly 2 years, as advertised. The economics director at S&P, Tim Moore, pointed to lower borrowing costs and a gradual recovery in market conditions. I don't think we could say he's wrong there. He also pointed to a robust expansion of incoming new work in August, so the immediate future looks fairly bright. There's also a concern for infrastructure work, which could be justified based on what our Chancellor has said thus far, in terms of postponing or cancelling infrastructure projects, citing black holes and shifting the blame to the last government. This is her largest mistake so far, for my money. Not investing in infrastructure is an error, and if the rules framework needs to be changed to recognise how valuable these infrastructure assets can be, when allocated well, to be clear, then the fiscal rules framework needs to be changed. This isn't a new drum to bang. The more sensible, less transitory economists have been calling for it for years. Staff hiring froze with staffing levels largely unchanged, cost pressures eased, and the market for materials is competitive according to the report. Overall, you'd like more months like August, not quite Goldilocks, but well on the right side of positive. To touch on manufacturing briefly, it was a positive report, domestic demand rising, strongest jobs growth for 2 years, although it cites concern over export orders. Input prices were also cited as rising, though with continued difficulty in higher shipping costs and material shortages. Rates of increase earned, but things still went upwards. 52.5, the manufacturing print, is a 26-month high, the highest since, just before she was Prime Minister. I concede on that one. So services, the biggie in terms of the macroeconomy, dominating so much of our GDP and output overall, and also one of the big sources of the recent inflation. The headline, UK service sector recovery gains momentum. Improving domestic demand also reported once again finally positive moves in this. Slowest rates of prices charged inflation for 3.5 years. The economics director this time around cites political stability, with new business activity increasing at a robust pace after a wobble around election time. This is 10 months in expansionary territory for services. You'll note that this basically started at the end of our now never mentioned technical recession at the end of 2023. Job creation was faster than the first half of 2024 on average, with additional staff being hired. The underlying message is healthy with controlled inflation. Just one sentence to knock us all off our respective perches. The final one. Some firms cited concerns about policy uncertainty in the run-up to the autumn budget. So, what's likely to dominate for many is the reforms that Labour has promised softly on workers' rights. My feeling, at a macro level, a lot of the most worrying parts, e.g. full rights from day one, appear to have already been dropped, so this probably won't play out as expected, but also uncertainty will dominate September and October's PMIs and will frankly knock GDP growth by 0.1 to 0.2% in what otherwise could have been a great year, especially for an election year. Could Labour stop this from happening? Well, yes, they could with better and more clear communication. Of course, there may be any sort of level of internal infighting going on at the moment about these policies, or they simply might not have made their minds up yet. But soft release to the public was quite well sharpened and practiced by the previous administration after we got past the Boris leaky bucket methodology of dissemination of information. So don't mess it up, basically, is my message to the government. The messages from the PMI should include that for August it was a good one. We never get carried away on 1 month's reports, but the overall direction of travel in the immediate future looks good for the UK economy. So the BBA mortgage rate, I don't cite it all that often, but this is little talked about these days in spite of a stark difference since pre-COVID times. I spoke with a successful portfolio builder this week, and he was telling me how many he knows who are sitting on 10% mortgages and simply losing money. I'd estimate those sitting on something that looks like the BBA rate and losing money month on month numbers about 1 million simply in the private rental sector at the moment. What is that rate? Well, it's the rate that people on variable, out of fixed term, not variable by choice, to be clear, mortgages are paying. So we were at 8.03% in June and July, which is the highest number so far since the series begins at the Bank of England, but there's been a big drop to 7.83 in August. Well, this is not a surprise, I hear you say. The base rate was cut. Agreed. The only surprise was that this caught some forecasters by surprise. Why? They were expecting rates to drop more slowly, can be the only explanation. But the banks, as a rule, are a little bit more on it after so much more scrutiny and criticism of how quickly they put rates up when the base rate was in a tightening cycle and how slow they've been historically to put them down as rates come down. Really, you should have expected 7.77, 25 basis points below the month before. But anyway, that's not the point I wanted to make. The point is 7.83 is actually the lowest print on this for 12 months. 12 months ago at 7.91, when base was 5.25, August 2023, was a meteoric shift upwards from 3.61 at the end of 2021. In only 20 months, the rate had more than doubled. To see that absorbed within the system without major fallout would not have been anything that many would have predicted. The more steady state rate for a lot of the 2010s was more like around 4.5%, although the banks would tell you that's because there were too many legacy loans tied to base plus a small margin, which of course are all dissipating as time goes on and those get redeemed, assets get sold, people pass on, etc., etc. We were at 7.75 in late 2007, in what might have been part of the alarm bells back then. But the more normalised interest rate era of the early 2000s, the typical number was more like 5.5 to 6.5%, which is what needs to return to this market. Lenders are still using very aggressive reversionary rates on many mortgages they're offering at the moment, 5% above base, etc., which was nowhere near the norm in 2024. This is trying to basically eat longer term margin out of loans whilst keeping advertised rates competitive. But I'd urge the regulators to take a look at this practice and start thinking about putting some pressure on in this department, because these sort of rates will and do lead to financial distress for borrowers. Okay, Halifax. They lead with a very bullish 4.3% year-on-year increase, finally realising the error of their ways in the start of 2024. I'm sure. Although strangely, they're not referring to it, as I always like to. Accountability, Strongest rate of growth since November 2022. Anything to say about that sort of date? No, I suppose I did promise. So, Halifax's average price is now back to August 2022's price. Halifax's head of mortgages cites base effects, the weak 2023 performance making this figure look good. Accurate, but it doesn't forgive their bearish forecasts at the start of this year. They've definitely changed their tune now, though. With market activity picking up and the possibility of further interest rate reductions to come, we expect house prices to continue their modest growth throughout the remainder of this year. Northern Ireland smashes on, printing a 9.8% annual increase in prices, according to Halifax. Wales up 5.5%. The Northwest still leads England on the Halifax numbers, similar to nationwide, up 4% this year. They didn't have anything more to add in terms of analysis this month other than citing affordability as the biggest break on the market because of the increase in mortgage rates, which isn't wrong, of course. So that leaves us with our comfort blanket of the gilts and swaps, and it was a comforting week indeed, a week that would expect further cuts in mortgage rates. We opened at 3.823% yield on the 5-year gilt and chugged along until Tuesday, middle of the day, when the release of US manufacturing figures and various T-bill auctions were released. Seem to be still expecting that 0.5% cut in the rate this month in the US. The market seems to be waiting and trying in many ways to force the hand of the Federal Reserve. So I've spoken extensively this year about the right price for the moment for the 5-year gilt being around 3.75, to drop to more like 3.5 as we approach the end of the year. We've been outside of my trading range of 3.5 to 4% a few times this year, but mostly to the upside. We're not a million miles away from seeing 3.25 as a more stable number, but I don't think we'll see that in 2024. We closed the week at 3.659, even after an attempted resurgence back towards that 3.75 late on Friday afternoon, as the probability of a Fed cut of 0.25% appeared more prevalent than before. We pretty much know the Fed's cutting this month, but we just don't know by how much, if it's 0.25 or 0.5%. And Thursday's close was 3.694, with a near gorgeous close on the 5-year swap at 3.583, which compares wonderfully to the 4.819% swap rate from 12 months ago, 6th of September 2023. This could see 5-year fixes for limited company buy-to-let closer to the 5.6% mark than the 5.8 to 5.9 mark. Now, I always talk about these with no fee, because obviously they can do weird and wonderful things with the rate if they put enough fees on the front end. Now, these have been prevailing for about a month or so, but all the eyes will be on the Federal Reserve meeting, as it will, in my opinion, continue to affect the UK gilts and swaps more than it should do. That's 1.5 weeks away, by the way, the Federal Reserve meeting, and I'm sure the markets are going to be oversensitive to next week's US inflation figures too. We always celebrate a down week though, right, in the yields. Getting those swaps back near the 3% level makes for a much healthier rental housing market for all participants, is the reality. The first US cuts and the pace of them and getting comfortable with them will steady market volatility and enable lenders to be more confident in product creation. Okay, so we're macroed out of our minds. Onto the deep dive, and first of all, some more developments on last week's efforts. Remember the clear messaging and the spin, which is always more of the author's choosing, of course. A solid number of ex-rentals up for sale, more than ever before, some headlines claim, and a real lack of new entrants to the market. So before I get stuck into this week's detail, I want to just zoom out in the strategic helicopter for a moment. Buy-to-let remains a comparatively young industry. There's no rule around your age for much in life, realistically, but if we accept the following facts and suppositions, I think it puts us into a better place to understand this analysis. Number one, the advent of the buy-to-let mortgage in 1996 really kick-started the sector. Number two, the sector underwent meteoric growth, not just in number, but in percentage of households that it housed between the early 2000s, and then it remained between 19 and 20% of all households since 2013-14. And that's data from the English Housing Survey, which is data collected, the most recent one we have is April 22 to March 23. So if we generalised and went in the midpoint and said that represents September 2022, Oh, not again. The meteoric growth is long over anyway, and steady state was entered, with wings clipped on supernormal profit, as economists would call it, by George Osborne in his 2015 budget, and then various times in various policy changes thereafter. Number 4, the number of units is most definitely relevant in order to understand the scale of the sector and any problems within it. Number 5, we're now roughly at the first sort of retirement wave. If we accept that the boom was 1996 to 2016, but a lot of the boom was front loaded in that period, sort of 96 to 06. But we're nowhere near the peak of that retirement wave. People are indisputably 28 years older than they were in 1996, or only 8 years older than they were in 2016, or they're not with us anymore. And then number 6, the past 6 years there are data for, the most recent of which will be that September 22 on average, show the number of rental units in total in England. Now we have to concentrate on England here rather than the UK, because they have much better and more widely available data. Now you would think, well, why wouldn't Scotland and Wales have better data? Because they have these wonderful registration and licensing schemes. And they do, but when they do, they're nonsensical. Because when you apply for a licence, you apply for it for a 5-year period. If you sell the property a year later, you've still got the licence. So they're not particularly good on that front, generally speaking. Of course, they could, those schemes, sort the data so that the property, when re-licensed, if it's been sold for let again, of course, and a lot of these are not being sold for let at the moment, they're being sold into the private market. But unfortunately, I've had a look at their figures and they're completely nonsensical. For example, Rent Smart Wales, there's a huge drop off after the first 5-year period, which probably tells you how many rentals that were rentals 5 years ago are not rentals anymore. But there's obviously going to be an element of turnover in the sector, and those have come back to roughly the same sort of numbers, which is what we see in England. So, reading from mid-2016, 4.85 million rental units. September 17, 4.79. September 18, 4.81. September 19, 4.7, so trending downwards. September 20, 4.73. September 21, 4.81. And September 22, 4.87. So heading back upwards again, but basically we're at the same number that we were in the mid 22 period, the latest one we've got data for, that we were in 2016. So that's 6 years before, so no growth in absolute number of units. Now, to be clear, that's the total number of units, including everything that's been let in the English Housing Survey, plus all the empty properties that are deemed to be buy-to-let. So voids, effectively, looking for tenants at the moment, etc., etc. Now, perhaps that's not what many might have expected. The ONS would have more up-to-date figures from their samples, because they monitor these on a monthly basis to report back on the rents. It might well be worth a Freedom of Information request or simply asking them to do some analysis. I'm busy framing exactly what that question might need to look like. But those numbers, again thanks to Chris Watkin for graphing them and bringing them to my attention, are appreciated. They don't, for example, speak to the fact that voids are 100,000 or so lower than they were pre-pandemic, as I cited last week. We have to rely on people like Zoopla for that, or the RICS House Price Balance survey that comes out every month. These numbers are just aggregated, so they don't split between voids and let. But we do know that 100,000 number is about right from last week's efforts. So they also show that no increase in 6 years. So why don't we look at the population changes in those last 6 years, thanks to the ONS? So population changes in those relevant time periods. So this is England and Wales, so you might have to take 6 to 7% off these numbers for them to be England only to compare apples with apples. But population movement in the same time period, year by year, plus about 1/3 plus 300,000, plus 300,000, plus 112,000, that's 2020 and the anomaly of people stopping moving around apart from anything else because of COVID. Mid-2021, 230,000, mid-2022, 585,000 net, and mid-2023, 610,000 net. Now, we haven't got the housing figures for 23-24 yet, and we won't until December. And I'm going to come back to that point again. So, even just considering the 22 to the 2017 numbers, we've got 1.88 million more people. Then we need to start thinking about the size of a household. Now, households are not getting particularly bigger on average. The long-term trend has been downwards rather than upwards, although COVID has distorted the figures a little bit. But I think we could agree, having a static number of rental units since 2017, unless in 2017 there was some kind of vast oversupply, which I've never seen a case made for, and I certainly didn't notice if it was within our portfolio or on the ground, might be somewhat problematic, and it was never going to be a sustainable solution. Now, this is really shouty time, because these figures are only talking about the time before the interest rates started to go up, almost exclusively. Between 2017 and mid-2021, arguably conditions got better for renting property, just on the financial side, to be clear. Lower mortgage rates, steady demand, availability of stock to buy, much lower costs of refurbishment than there are today. For example, stacking deals was easier. The mortgage rate differential is, in my view, the single largest change to hit the private rented sector for many years. It still only affects, depending on which sources you believe, 50% or so of landlords. The others are unencumbered. Crazy numbers, I know, but if you correlate the FCA lending data to this data, that's what it tells you. And the regulators' numbers should be very good. They are drawn from the banks after all. So these numbers tell nothing of the tale of the more recent tape over the past 18 to 24 months. The real-time data is much more likely to be reflective of what Hamptons, the NRLA, and a plethora of other organisations are saying. The scepticism is clear in the Bank of England, even though they hold two opposing views to an extent. Firstly, that landlords bail out much more easily than homeowners in the event of a crisis, which you would expect to have an element of truth. But secondly, that landlords don't particularly act like economic animals when market conditions change. I fear that what the bank missed somehow is that market conditions for landlords have changed significantly, and perhaps understandably, because housing rarely becomes part of their brief at the committee meetings, unless the market looks particularly overheated. On the other side of the fence, though, the argument could be that the boy has cried wolf so many times since Dear George's summer budget in 2015. I'd probably argue instead the death's been by 1,000 cuts and not a short, sharp shock. Harder to see, but the pace of the interest rate change and then a near year of extreme pain for those on variable rates, with another year at least to come of much higher rates than experienced before, going back to our BBA analysis earlier on, then without dramatic rent rises, it's all on the table to see. I also need to inject some more balance into the numbers above, because there's something missing, isn't there? To appreciate where the people actually are in real time, we do need to consider the number of new units added to the broader stock base of housing in the UK, or as it's known, net additional dwellings. And really, again, we need to concentrate on England, so we're comparing apples with apples. These were very poorly added to for many years, since the 1980s really, but not enough was done, or the correct policies were not really enacted to really move the market. So net additional dwellings, so imagine what they're talking about, how many new dwellings are registered, minus however many dwellings are taken out of the register, sometimes demolition, sometimes just removed from the register altogether for other reasons, but primarily demolition. So mid-2017, we had a net new 222,190 dwellings. 18, about 240,000, 19, about 240,000, 20, about 216,000, as things slowed thanks to COVID, 21, 233,000, 22, 235,000. Now, 23, we don't have the housing figures yet, and we won't until very late November, early December. But we do know housing starts are down significantly, because we've looked at that in recent weeks. But let's be generous and say 245,000 net additional dwellings. I don't think there's going to be anything like that. That would be the best figure in the past 7. And this is where it gets interesting. The number of people per household on average, about 2.4, 2.36 to be precise, which has been relatively stable for the past decade. So mix those two together, each new household provides housing for 2.4 people, and the situation from 2017 onwards looks quite different. Remember, we didn't start 2017 with enough houses, or perhaps more accurately, with enough of the right sort of houses in the right locations. I think that would be much more accurate. So mid-2017, we gained 335,000 population, 141,828 households, if we just divide by 2.36. But we had 222,190 new units. So 80,000 households more could be accommodated than the growth. And you'd see, I think, if you looked at those figures, that trend goes on until 2023. In 2023, 610,000 more people, which is 258,000 households, and has above an unknown number of net new dwellings. But if we did hit 245,000, that's nearly enough, even for those pretty gigantic immigration figures, right? Well, what's all the fuss about then? Well, I think we've got to go one level deeper. Firstly, are there more or fewer empty homes per year? The data varies, but the government figures, when cobbled together, suggest, according to think tanks, that overall, taking into account the number of short-term empty homes, second homes, empty homes paying a council tax premium, and unoccupied homes that are exempt from council tax, more than 1 million dwellings are empty in England, which is an increase of 60,000 since 2018. Now, we know from previous analysis that the voids in the private rental sector run to about 250,000 to 400,000 at any one time, and are by all accounts at very much the lower end of that number at the moment. I'd liken this to a bit like structural unemployment. Some people will always be unemployed when you take a cross-sectional measure in time. They've just left a job, they've just been made redundant, they're relocating and the likes. They're employable, they might even have a job offer, but at that point in time they're unemployed. Somewhere around 2 to 3% of unemployment of the workforce is explained by that sort of structural unemployment. So you might be happy to say though, oh well, despite the progress made in all of these years, apart from mid-2023, we've lost 60,000 of those net dwellings for a whole variety of reasons, because they've gone into the empty sector. We also need more from net additional dwellings, I'm sure you will agree. It's no use if they're all one-bed flats, because they aren't housing 2.36 people on average. Might be in London, of course, but the average household size in London is higher, closer to 2.7. Okay, it's okay, surely, because we can find out what the product mix is. How many bedrooms in the average new build in the UK? Well, here's where it gets interesting. The government net additional dwellings figures don't have this categorisation or ask this question. Even ChatGPT, the paid version as well, doesn't know. No one can add anything to the results from the census, which interestingly the way they're presented show, now remember we're comparing 2021 results now to 2011 results, so bear that in mind, but this is the best we can do. One bedroom homes represent 11.4% of households, about 2.8 million, slightly down from 11.8 in 2011. Two beds, 27.1% of households, around 6.7 million, down from 27.6 in 2011. Three bedroom homes, 40.4% of households, about 10 million, also showing a decrease from 41.6% in 2011. And then four or more bedroom homes, 21.1% of households, around 5.2 million, up from 19% in 2011, indicating a trend towards larger homes being built or occupied, or extensions, of course, to provide extra bedrooms. And many will remember, especially around times of COVID, extension was an extremely popular solution for people who found that now they work from home, they needed extra space at home, aside from anything else. And of course, things like stamp duty clog up the market and make it much easier and much more attractive to extend than it is to go and buy new or buy an existing secondary market property and sell up. So what can we read into that? Well, something I've anecdotally said for many years from the developments I've observed. There's no money for SME developers in building 2 or 3 bed houses. Conversions to 1 bed flats, well, they tend to stack up and they stack for build to rent. Out the ground flats works as long as the mix is primarily 1 bed to sell or rent. Then they go all the way to the other end of the spectrum to get things to stack up again. 4+ bedroom executive detached, possibly on the green belt or somewhere nearby, possibly an element of conversion, sympathetically built. The only ones making the 2 to 3 bed market work outside of flats are the bigger house builders, with volume on sites, and being honest in this day and age, working with smaller properties on cramped sites with small gardens and tight roads. Resale on these properties is difficult or attracts very little premium to the purchase price for many years, because said developers are so good at squeezing the lemon at all points in order to make an acceptable margin. Their margins tend to be very healthy indeed. But when the battle is inexperienced first-time buyer versus highly experienced developer, who would you expect to win? So, how many people are living on those estates, these larger ones? Some families, of course, but I bet the average household numbers aren't much more than 2.36, as I know plenty of these properties with 50-plus-year-old inhabitants who've grown-up children not living with them. They've just got the money to enjoy a property like that, often unencumbered. It must be higher than the average, but not to a large degree is my sense. I've got no evidence for that, That's just heuristics. It's just my gut feel. But it's a huge shift, and it fits with the narrative that the time of zero interest rate policy and quantitative easing helped a small percentage get wealthier. What suffered the most by miles is 3-bed dwellings. I'd love to hear from developers who specialise in these sorts of sites. I've never met one at all my time networking in the flesh and online in property. Not anymore, anyway. I know people who have done it, but I don't know people who are still doing it in volume. So we're heading towards the nub of the problem then. We have built enough units, is what we're saying, net, and even enough to cope with a massive increase in net migration that happened from 2022 onwards. Numbers are down dramatically, but still to pre-pandemic highs of migration, like many figures in terms of what we're told. It simply must be the wrong mix of units, plus more and more properties lying empty each year. So this is where I want to now introduce the report, The Broken Ladder, which is the Home Builders Federation report that was published this week. There's an exec summary first up, and don't worry, this isn't one of these government special reports 100 pages long. There are only 7 pages in the entire report, so don't panic. I've replicated the bullets verbatim because these are bullets that, like bullets should be, punchy and straight to the point. For first-time buyers, the price-to-income ratio in England is 10, meaning that the average property value is 10 times the average annual net salary. This rises to over 12 in the southeast, southwest and east of England, and is over 16 in London. For the average first-time buyer, the monthly mortgage payment was 47% of net salary in 2004 and 2014. As of 2024, this has risen by 20 percentage points to 67%. First-time buyers in England would have to save 50% of their discretionary income for 9 years to save the necessary deposit. This rises to 13 plus years for those looking to buy in the South East and London. After setting aside rent and bills, first-time buyers in England are facing a deposit that is more than 400% of their remaining income. So these are some quite incredible claims, but you can see why the report has been named Broken Ladder. Let's first of all start by pouring a little water on these, or at least taking a sensible viewpoint and having a go at some of these arguments. We need to remember the Bank of Mum and Dad has been named as the 9th biggest mortgage lender in the UK informally. And that's a vast underestimate of the contribution of Bank of Mum and Dad. Why? Well, because the average first-time buyer is in fact using a pretty significant deposit, about 20% as it goes, figures tell us. So 80% comes from one of the larger mortgage lenders, usually, and only 20% comes from the Bank of Mum and Dad. And of course it isn't the whole 20%. Sensible parents want skin in the game from their children, and so either manage it on their own or without parental contribution anyway. So we're tending towards guesswork territory here, but at a ratio of 4-1 in favour of the senior debt lender, if they're the 9th biggest when they only have 20% to lend at rather than 80%, they're likely to be much, much more important to the system than that, and they certainly can't be ignored in any analysis. Where are they getting that money from? Well, sometimes from their own houses, which have significant equity, or at least provide them with a comfortable cushion from which they can dish funds out without incurring a monthly or ongoing cost to themselves. The shrewd ones would do it via equity release, I would think, offering inheritance now rather than inheritance later. That's how I'd frame it anyway. Equity release is a live runner here. Anyway, back to the report. They seem to be operating on the basis that Bank of Mum and Dad doesn't exist, let alone plays a very active role in what's a just about functioning market for first-time buyers. Where's the massive shift? Well, once again, it's exactly where it is for the landlords. The cost of an interest-only mortgage, and let's forget 2020 to 2022 for the purposes of this conversation, knowing that the yield curves were massively distorted by the pandemic. In 2019, it was about 3.75%, and I'm talking buy-to-let there, right? All costs taken into account. The BBA rate, as referred to earlier in this article, 7.83, was actually around 4.3% in 2019. So the BBA is 82% higher, and the interest-only rate is about 5.75, as I was saying earlier on. That's 53% higher. That tells you about the distortionary effect of the debt. Way above inflation, way above wage inflation, etc., etc. But how about for homeowners? Well, you can control the increase per month a little more easily with repayment, longer terms, partial amortisation. There are other possibilities. Lower margins, frankly. Interest was, however, at about 1.7 versus 4.8. if we compare the average 75% loan to value mortgage issued to homeowners using the Bank of England figures. Well, that's a 182% increase between 2019 and 2024. And if the repayment profiles were not extended and none of that trickery was used, a probable 150% or so increase in the mortgage payment for first-time buyers. Hold on for a second though. Remember that drum I've been banging ever since the lid got lifted on the rates. The reason why I was very convinced we wouldn't see huge contractions or swathes of repossessions or massive drops in prices was the ability for that rate, for that 75% mortgage, not exceeding 5.5% for any significant period of time by much. Why that 5.5%? Well, it was the old money stress test rate that was live between 2012 and 2021. Didn't mean that all lenders necessarily had to use it, but it was very widely used across the industry, and it was stipulated by the regulator. That 5.5 actually dropped to 5.25 in 2021 before it got removed altogether in 2022. It was what the regulator had recommended. So what happened in the real world was that in 2019, people were stress tested at 5.5, they paid 1.7 on average, and they pocketed the rest. Some will have overpaid the mortgage. Some will have had more than one holiday or spent on discretionary spending somewhere else. We don't know what happened to that money, so it remains guesswork. But we can see that consumption has rode back since 2019 in terms of volume of retail sales, for example. And why? My opinion, very much because it's going on the cost of putting and keeping a roof over your head, whether you own or whether you rent. Ultimately, even if you've got no mortgage, like 36% of the households, it's still costing a fair bit more to live, although you haven't been hit quite as broadly. But of course, lots of those unencumbered households tend to be older, aren't necessarily having gigantic amounts of discretionary spending anyway. So we actually only exceeded that 5.5% stress test for 6 months in total over this whole cycle. 2 of those months were October and November 2022. Should I? Okay, I won't. This rate went from 3.6% August 22 to 4.17% September 22 to 5.99 October 22. The other 4 months were when the yield curve got particularly nasty in the middle of 2023. July 2023 was particularly nasty at 6.22. So this was the rate that the average 80% first-time buyer mortgage was having to be drawn down at, according to the Bank of England. In November 23, it dropped back to 5.28, and it's currently falling at an okay pace and looks set to continue to do so slowly, with a few twists and turns left for the moment, but the upside risk for the moment has largely dissipated as we enter this cutting part of the cycle. The only thing we don't know at the moment is just how quickly that cutting part is going to be. But just look at those interest rate increases in that time, leading up in 22. Nothing that's happened in the past 20 years comes anywhere near close to that distortionary effect on affordability in such a short space of time. Look at it another way. If I'm not completely off with my ballpark 1 million landlords losing money month to month, who are stuck on their floating rates, then it's far more profitable for the tenants to be in those properties than a property that they own. That stands to reason. You can chip that argument. I mean, tenants' own mortgages would be cheaper, for example, but you do get my general point. However, we're now back in a world where people are being stress tested at higher rates. The lowest at this time would be base plus 1, which at this time would be 6%, of course. I'm not au fait with the stress tests across the industry on residential mortgages, I'm afraid, and unless there are any CMAP resi specialists listening to this who could get their hands on the data, we'll have to trust what ChatGPT tells us, which is always a dangerous place to be. But GPT tells us that various sources say it's currently around 3% above the reversion rate and suggests that equates to 9% at the moment in terms of the stress tests. Now, I don't think that's true, right? But if it is true, the world's greatest opportunity exists for lenders who would be happy to stress test at 6 or 7%. They'd be taking a view that significant inflation from here is unlikely, a view they could hedge against if we wanted to get technical about it, but I'd love some insight from some resi brokers if you're listening to this. It's one hell of a handbrake, which frankly the regulator could intervene in and issue some guidance. If it really is that bad, the guidance would be very helpful. If people are getting stress tested at 9% and still getting loans, then we know they can definitely afford them, and that much I can say for sure. But imagine how many people that is pricing out who I think could afford a loan at the moment, but are being struck out on affordability calculations. Now, you might see this as a bit of a nuance, and I suppose it is one, but I feel it very strongly needs to be explained. It's not contained in this report, this broken ladder report. It's not contained in any of the wider analysis out there at the moment. It's just being written off with mentioning affordability and then immediately blaming the high interest rate on affordability. But affordability is more nuanced than that in the way that it's calculated, right? It's not just higher mortgage rates. I'm trying to answer the questions I believe should be asked. How much higher? What does it really mean for affordability? Are the stress test protections right anymore in the current market today, having been through a 1 in 100 year event and the huge volatility that's incurred on the back of it? So, the Home Builders Federation then makes the lead to the fact that there has been 18 barren months without Help to Buy or equivalent scheme that has a long pedigree. As so many of their larger members would have made so much money from Help to Buy, it's hard for me not to be cynical. I think my points above would do much more for affordability than the next Help to Buy scheme. 95% mortgages are there anyway. 100% mortgages have been mooted at various lenders for years. Underwriting them doesn't seem to have got the rates down overly aggressively. And if you think about it, what you could do, and HBF have got some suggestions, I've got some different suggestions later on, one of which being it isn't 5 years over which the equity loan would come in from the government if you did revive Help to Buy. It might have to be a 10-year period, because this might help with the stress testing. Again, longer periods, 5 years, whilst considered long for a UK mortgage, because the alternative historically has been 2 years, is not long enough. And this is something we've learned in this cycle, but we haven't learnt it. No one seems to have learnt it, because the products aren't being delivered, and maybe the products aren't being created because the demand's not there. But both sides are blaming each other, whereas really what we should have is someone talking about this and offering guidance to people, saying, do you know what? A 7 to 10 year fix that's portable might be a good idea at the moment. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, one of the problems is most of us think that interest rates are on the way down. So perhaps we shouldn't be fixing for that longer period of time. Although what we should be more clear about is they are on the way down, but currently the way things are looking, they might go down another 1% or so. We're already seeing some 3.5x and 3.6x in the market. Do you think we're going down below 2.5x at any point in the relatively near future in the next 5-7 years? Probably not, unless there's one more major crisis that knocks the interest rate off its perch. So, back to Help to Buy. The whole time the scheme ran, which was 10 years, a 95% mortgage was, on average, 37.2% more expensive than a 90% mortgage when comparing the two interest rates. Take a note here. That means if the average 90% mortgage was 1%, the average 95% mortgage was 1.372%. A really expensive privilege, no doubt justified because there'd be administration costs to running the scheme, and I'm sure there were. Since it was phased out, which is only 18 months of course, what's the average premium for a 95% mortgage over a 90% mortgage? That would tell us, wouldn't it? Well, it's 8% now, not 37.2. Or, put another way, less than a quarter of the premium that existed when Help to Buy was on. Here's an alternative way of looking at this. The 95% market didn't really exist when Help to Buy came out. Now it does, right? Help to Buy for the vast majority of that time was only concentrating on new units altogether, so they aped the appearance of the 95% loan in existing stock by creating the 95% mortgage. But now, at the moment, there isn't this gigantic margin suddenly in these higher. And why? Why is that? You know, is it all just a bit of a con job or whatever? Not necessarily. What the banks have now got, of course, is they've got over 10 years of data about 95% mortgages and how often they're in arrears, how often they're repossessed, and all the rest of it. And they're obviously not an incredible amount higher because they're not commanding a huge risk premium, right? So there's actually data in the market now. Just looks like one of those good old government schemes, to be honest. Makes you wonder why that Persimmon Triumvirate got that £100 million bonus that they got again. Sounds like a straightforward transfer of wealth from the government to the house builders, or from the people to the house builders, and should never really be called anything else. Now, I might be being a bit harsh with that analysis, and I always try to be as fair and fastidious as possible. There are other arguments. Now rates are back to normal, lenders can't gouge mortgage borrowers anymore, and they have to go back to gouging the savers instead. Sorry, what I mean is that the margin is once again loaded against the savers, which it is mostly, and not so much against the borrowers, because there isn't that room in the marketplace. And I've spoken for the last few years about how this counterbalance would swing back, and it's taken a bit of time for it to swing back, but there it is. It doesn't look like a great argument for me, though, to reintroduce Help to Buy. The 2023 introduced government mortgage guarantee scheme indeed could be the reason for the cratering in the difference in the price between 95% and 90% mortgages and even lower loan-to-value mortgages, because that's been extended to more than just new build. That scheme runs until the middle of 2025. If that scheme was working, you'd expect no higher rates for 95% than 75. Of course, some people wouldn't be qualifying for it, and that would be the reason for the difference in the rates, to be clear. And there are some other inconvenient truths that don't help with the 10 times salary argument being so unaffordable either. No increase in real house prices in the UK, if we use RPI as our measure of inflation, for the last 20 years. And I've been talking about it for over a year now. Wages have only just about kept pace with RPI, but they're a little bit ahead of RPI. But that means that circumstances in terms of affordability haven't got worse, of course, apart from the change in the interest rate. In 1987, the multiple was higher than 10. This is not a new phenomenon, and there are a handful of other years you can cherry pick, and don't make no mistake, it is cherry picking, but going back over the past 4 decades to prove this isn't a new point or a new problem. In many ways, the best bit of this report is to show the stark contrast between areas of the UK. There's no middle ground. The phrase of 2024 summer, I'd argue, is two-tier. I've heard it so many times, I'm definitely sick of it, but this shows a very two-tier housing versus rental market, and that's why I've used this week's image from the HBF Broken Ladder report. It's a classic average buster. The average household, as they said in their bullets, needs to save 50% of their annual income after bills for 9 years to save a deposit, but that's only a household of 1, remember, which is not a realistic household number. There's 2.36 people in every average household, as we said, of which 1.75 or so might well be earning and contributing towards the household income. In reality, though, you find it's two-tier because it's either 3 to 5 years that you need to save half of your discretionary income for, so that's after tax, after everything else, after essentials are all paid. You can save a deposit within 3 to 5 years in the more affordable parts of the country as a single person, right? Which doesn't feel unreasonable to me. Or it's 10 to 14 years in the more expensive parts of the country, 14, of course, being in London. That's quite literally no middle ground between those two tiers. There is this gap, 3 to 5, 10 to 14, nothing going on in the middle. Now, the next bit's a bit naughty. They quote the affordability problem looked at over the past 2 decades, and the figures they choose to use are a 10% deposit and the resulting payment from a 90% mortgage. Now, they only look at 04, 14 and 24. In 2014, rates were beautifully low, of course, but my points around affordability scoring would still apply, right? They would still need to be stress tested at the 5.5. For 2004, they quoted rates for 90% mortgages, which were a fair bit below the rates on the Bank of England database for 75% LTV mortgages. Now, of course, that's impossible, and it throws some fairly serious aspersions on the credibility of the whole report for me and the agenda of it. So, for the purposes of the tape, they claim 90% mortgages were available at an average of 5.07, whereas the Bank of England had the 75s that year at 5.19. For the record, in 2014, 90% mortgages were 78% more expensive than 75% mortgages. So if you rolled that forward, the rate in 2004 would have been 9.24%. If instead you simply applied the same absolute margin, in 2014, 90% were 168 basis points above the 75% mortgages. So that would have made the 90s 6.87 in 2004. But either answer dramatically changes the impact of the analysis, which is very weak when you're only looking once per decade anyway, and can make a handy little point if you want it to. So I just assume they think no one looks or checks on these things, which is exactly why I do it. Even the lower of my 2 correcting estimates put the affordability point at a much closer level today to 2004. And as I've said, the use of 1 full-time worker's average salary is pretty pointless in my view, as very few single full-time workers can realistically aspire to home ownership. That's not a new view, but a reality ever since households started to have more than 1 income many decades ago now. Still, my annoyance at their inaccuracies does not invalidate other conclusions that they make from the English Housing Survey and the likes. For example, trends on ownership. Between 03-04 and 22-23, Home ownership dropped from 24% to 10.3% amongst 16 to 24-year-olds. Dropped from 58.6 to 44.7 amongst 25 to 34-year-olds. 74.3 to 59 amongst 35 to 44s. 80.6 to 67.4, 45 to 54s. 81.5 to 71.3 amongst 55 to 64-year-olds. Only the 65 plus saw an increase during this time, growing from 71 to 78.4. Now again, I'm going to have to take a little segue here and just say a few things. Number one, the increase in life expectancy over 20 years is not normalised throughout that analysis, and it would need to be borne in mind, because when you're adding on a couple of years, as you would be 2 to 3 years in life expectancy, it does shift people's career paths. We've got, education till 18 now rather than 16, which we've had for some time. It's not taken into account in those figures, and it should be. But you can't deny they look pretty bad for everybody apart from the 65 plus age group, right? There's definitely been a distortionary effect, most concentrated on the lower bands, right? And you're not seeing a great increase from 45 to 54 up to 55 to 64 with, around 70% over that whole bracket being homeowners and the other 30% therefore renting, which is pretty incredible when you think about 36%-ish, 35-36% of the country rent as a general rule. It's not a lot lower in that 45 to 64 bracket these days, which is pretty incredible. But it's when you come to conclusions that are the problems, right? And we're getting towards my final words for this week, but I'm going to line by line their conclusions, because with what I feel we can conclude after this and last week's analysis. So they say, these results show how difficult getting onto the property ladder is. A long-term undersupply problem has pushed house prices up, and currently, for the first time in 25 years, there is no government-backed support scheme to help with property purchases. To genuinely bridge the home ownership gap, a new government industry equity loan scheme should be established. Now, I'm struggling to make sense of this conclusion because, firstly, we're not convinced on the most recent figures. There is a true long-term undersupply problem, as I've said. On the right mix of units, I'm absolutely convinced there's a long-running problem that's got more complexity to it. So on numbers of net new units versus household creation, I'm absolutely not convinced because of the data that I've been through today already. Secondly, there's no government-backed support scheme to help with property purchases apart from the government mortgage guarantee scheme, which is running till the middle of next year. Why are we ignoring this altogether? Because it isn't solely focused on new units? It's just not clear to me why that should be. Back to the report. A new equity loan scheme could support first-time buyers. A new scheme could boost first-time buyers' deposits, giving them access to new build mortgages, which are more affordably priced. It could see developers paying a fee similar to the commercial fee payable by mortgage lenders for access to the mortgage guarantee scheme. It could involve developers covering a portion of the upfront investment in the form of a fee, which would see the government retain the full equity share. Under this proposed scheme, the first-time buyer would require a 5% deposit. This would be matched in the form of an equity loan from the government, which would include a developer fee from the participating developer equivalent to 1% of the sales price. So clever in theory, I guess, but it feels like a think tank lobbying for its members rather than a solution for the economic good of the masses, doesn't it? And it ignores the real point about affordability that I'm saying, if we're at that 9% stress test level, which to be clear, I still don't believe because we just come from GPT, but if we are at the 9% stress test level, that's where the affordability pressure is right here today, not the difficulty of saving this deposit, which shouldn't be looked at as one person trying to save it anyway. Right, but there we go. So whilst the Exchequer has made a significant return on its investment in the Help to Buy initiative from the first 40% of equity loans that have been paid off by homeowners, a scheme that also provides an upfront fee from developers would offer even more investment return potential. I think we might need to concentrate on what developers have lifted from said schemes, not just what the government have made, mightn't we, if we're going to have a balanced view of this. The government should also consider working with lenders to expand the market for green mortgages. Whilst lenders seem to offer more favourable LTV rates to those buying existing properties, the market for green mortgages for new builds remains very limited. A very good, fair, but minor point really, but I do agree with it. HBS research on the running costs of new build and existing properties find that those buying a new build house will save over £183 a month, over £2,200 per year. When calculating whether a mortgage applicant can reasonably meet monthly mortgage repayments, a range of monthly costs are estimated. Despite the clear financial savings associated with newer properties and the presence of an energy performance certificate to evidence this, typically home buyers are assessed against one national average assumption for energy costs. Now, I'm sorry, that's just not going to be true, unfortunately, because of you can just simply look at the energy price cap. Right, the energy price cap looks at the average household and bills it would pay if it was on the variable rate, and the energy price cap is under £1,800 on its own. So they're not going to be spending 2,200 more. What you might be talking about in that report, in the report there, is a G versus an A or something like that, and then I could believe it. Or this analysis was done when electricity was 40p a kilowatt back in the absolute height of the late 2022 issues, which were primarily brought to bear, of course, by the Russia-Ukraine situation. But as we know, we've analysed this before, it was more complex than that, right? Now, if you did do this and you used AI as well, it could be a bit of a game changer on affordability. It might also assess what's spent on Uber Eats and the likes, so it could be a bitter pill for swallow for some, if you pardon the pun. But the actual savings from better EPCs making a difference to affordability is one more way to influence the market to sort out its own leaky houses, rather than sit with difficult retrofitting problems. The market price would help to clear the leaky stock one way or another. It would be bad news for tenants as a rule if there's no government help on EPC upgrades, but it might be a sensible way to lean on homeowners to take action. And let's face it, they can stick with the PRS if they want to, but that doesn't address 81% of the housing stock in the UK. And of course, around about half the PRS has already addressed the issues that it's having with low EPCs. So if you focus on the PRS, you're looking at 9% of the stock, whereas if you were going to focus on half of the rest of the stock, you'd be looking at 40-something% of the stock. And then the net zero zeal with which this government is just arbitrarily approaching 2030 as the year by which these things need to be done is kind of ridiculous, really. But there we go. So this affords no mortgage affordability benefit to those home buyers who opt to purchase a more energy efficient home with lower monthly running costs. With mortgage affordability increasingly important to many households, lenders should progress mortgage products that offer tangible financial incentives for home buyers to make environmentally conscious energy saving choices. And this, if we're going to have an interventionist government, which this government is more interventionist than the last one, at least be intervening in these sort of things and nudging people in the right direction. I have no issue with that, right? Now, it wasn't really what any of their report was about, but it is relatively common sense, although, as I say, the 2,200 figure I think is nonsense, and they provide no sources for that, but there we go. I'm glad I read it, but the evidence contained within was nowhere near as damning as it was presented to be, I didn't think, or when it was presented, it simply wasn't correct. I do want to end with a postscript, though, because I thought I was going to be out of time, but I managed just to nick a little more. I had to go into the census 2021 and compare to the census 2011 to have a look at this problem of the exact figures by bedroom instead, rather than having to requisition the ONS to do it. So 2011 first, England only, again because the census focuses on England and Wales. One beds have gone from just under 2.6 million to just over 2.7 million, so they're up by about 5% in those 10 years. Two beds from 6.15 million to 6.4 million, they're up by only 4%. Three beds from 9.1 million to 9.375 million, they're only up by 3.14%. And then 4+ beds, we went from 4.18 million to 4.95 million, a massive increase of 18.26%. So if you don't think the points I made earlier on about developers only really making profits in nice leafy 4-bed plus estates, especially SME developers I'm talking about there, I think it's one of the only things they can do anymore that makes any money, or the points around massive amounts of extensions, changing existing stock into larger stock, well, the evidence is there for you. But we can't be looking at the total number of households, which, as I said, is really where we need to concentrate, is up by 6.22% in that 10-year period. So we've done around about half of the increase in households have been reflected in 3-bedroom houses, which are still the largest mix of households in the country, as you can see, still 9.375 million of them. So massively deficient in not only building 3s and 2s, but also 1s, which did surprise me a little bit. We're lagging on the 1s, 5% compared to that 6.22. Massive difference, and a plethora of 4 beds, which of course, apart from anything else, if we want to talk about affordability, are way more problematic from an affordability perspective. Let's just imagine you're living today in a 4-bed house that was a 3-bed, and you started doing extension during the lockdown, right? Or after the lockdown, because during the lockdown would have been quite hard, of course. So after the first lockdown, I needed some more room, and I was still building at, let's pluck a figure out of the air, I was still building at 1,800 per square metre, or that's what I was paying the builder to deliver that product, right? If I was paying the builder to deliver that product today, I'd probably be paying the builder 2,800 or 3,000 per metre. Such is the level of construction inflation. Now, when I sell it, because it's probably in a slightly nicer area, I'm going to be selling it at that sort of level as well, that sort of 300 per square foot. Sorry, I'm mixing my imperials and my metrics there, but that 3,000 per metre, let's say 3,500 per metre, 4,000 per metre, that value's been added to the house. But what does that mean? It means it's got more unaffordable, doesn't it, for people, apart from anything else. So that's where the market's sitting at the moment, and that's the distortionary effect. And remember, Census 21, right? This wasn't necessarily, there wasn't all this COVID factor in the 2021 figures necessarily. You know, we're going to have to wait till 2031's figures to see this again, until the ONS want to do a more regular report on it, or until the government understand that the product mix truly is the product mix and mortgage affordability and stress testing and just the size of the mortgage rate at the moment, right? Those are the problems in a nutshell. Those are the problems in the cauldron. And until they start to actually address those problems, we're not going to get anywhere, I don't think. So let's refresh a bit of what we learned earlier. The average household size hasn't gone up between 2011 and 2021. We've had this trend downwards for centuries, less so in recent decades, but still downwards as fewer get married and more divorce. So there, right there is the broken ladder, folks. It just doesn't work to build enough 3-bed semis and terraces. If I was so inclined, I'd break those 2-bed figures down into houses and flats. But I think I know what we would find. Right, there'd be more flats being created than there would be houses. The product mix is broken, and the only true houses to develop, clearly, in terms of the market, are 4+ beds. So this is where the social sector and the HJs have been deficient, and this is where the government concentration needs to be. I was surprised 1-beds weren't more ahead of 2s and 3s, and I was stunned that the 4+ difference was that stark. But there you go. That's why I love the data. It has no agenda. It doesn't lie. What makes me surprised is I've had to do the work myself because no one else is talking about it. But that's life. And then I'll ask you one question to think about for finishing this one off for the week. How do PD rights to convert houses into flats help with this problem? I hope you've enjoyed it this week. My views might be a bit controversial here, especially to some of the listeners, but if I'm on the wrong track, please feel free to let me know because I always welcome feedback. But before I go, don't forget you can still book your early bird tickets for the 4th Property Business Workshop of the year, bit.ly/PBWFOUR, Tuesday the 1st of October in London. Just over 1 week of early bird left to go. There's only this one way you can deal with this continual noise and all the mixed messages and all the nonsense, frankly, in terms of analysis that you read in the entertainment media. Keep calm, always listen to the supplement and carry on. And now I'm just going to address a couple of comments that I've had. Shyam, thanks for commenting. Shyam asks, which lenders would be your favourite to move your older term mortgages with the thought that no more than 25% allocation in total to the lender of the stock? So let me just explain that a little bit first for people. I know Shyam knows where that question's coming from, and I do, but just in case you don't, I always advocate, as a portfolio grows, not to expose yourself to more than 25% of your debt in whole numbers. So we're not necessarily talking about numbers of units and things like that. It's not relevant if you've got a lot of cheap units and then some more expensive stuff. We're talking about the debt quantum not to be above 25% exposure to any one lender. Much easier when you've got a broader portfolio. But why? Well, primarily because one of the biggest mistakes I've seen over and over again is people relying on one lender. And then that one lender changes their strategy, changes their goalposts, changes something else, doesn't like you anymore, whatever. Why would you have that as a risk in your business? You get paid nothing for that risk. Yes, there's extra administration involved, but the insurance that it gives you is massive. So, Shyam's talking, he says, specifically about banks rather than wholesalers, right? So, there are deposit takers, and then there are also packagers or wholesalers, as he refers to them as. The packagers or wholesalers are lenders who get money from a bank at the back, maybe a bank who's not even primarily active in UK buy-to-let as far as we see it. Citibank, HSBC, JP Morgan, it could be lots of other banks behind a lot of these smaller package lenders, or there are deposit takers, people like he mentions, Paragon, One Savings Bank, Aldermore, or would you prefer to rate hunt? Cheyenne says, thinking that liquidity would be better with a bank as opposed to a wholesaler. And to an extent that's true, Cheyenne, but when you get to the end of some of these terms with the package lenders, you often find it's quite a smooth process to product transfer apart from anything else. Whereas with the portfolio loans at the banks, they want a full revaluation, they want to have a whole variety of other things to go on. So there are pluses and minuses to that. You have to consider how much administration it takes to do a mortgage. I'm still, frankly, punting on the basis that in the next 5-year cycle, so within 5 years of today, we're going to see more of these automated valuation models. We're going to see an easier route to conveyancing, hopefully improved by some AI, and we're going to get some of the completely unnecessary costs down of moving a loan, especially when you've established a very, very good track record. So it really does depend. I mean, I'm quite a big fan of Lloyd's, to be honest with you. 70% loan to value. Right, so you have to bear that in mind if you're looking to leverage to the nines, but at some point you have to move away from leveraging up so much. Realistically, when your growth path has started to calm down more, you can afford for your leverage to be lower, and I'd much prefer 70 to 75. I think below 60 is not trying hard enough probably, but that's me taking a commercial corporate viewpoint to the whole thing. When you get to the level where your debt might be 100 million or more, then 25% of your debt, 25 million, most banks are going to want to look at 60% LTV there anyway as an absolute maximum. There will still be the Shawbrooks of the world who will do that. Do I have any favourites? Well, as I say, some of them are pushing forward. The people pushing forward on these automated valuation models, Shawbrook and Landbay. Shawbrook do normally command a premium, but as I say, Lloyd's are quite good at taking a view and being quite pragmatic. They won't necessarily, as the portfolio really gets bigger, expect to value every property because it's not realistic in person. There might be desktop valuations and all the rest of it. They can be, and if I had to pick a least favourite one, to be honest, I'd pick Handelsbanken because they're just not really a very can-do bank on the resi front. Their loan to value is automatically lower. Their legal costs are pretty high and pretty onerous in terms of the PGs and the specifics around how they want you to do a PG. It's a bit of an insult really when you've done 10, 50, 100, 1,000 PGs by now. It's a bit ridiculous. So I don't think there's necessarily much to be said for HB, but I do think there are some of the high street can be okay, and it's going to then depend on loan to value because the high street then ducks out pretty quickly. Lloyd's are pretty consistent at the 70% level. They're pretty flexible on 5-year fixes, 10-year fixes, 40-year partial amortization periods, interest only. They've really moved forward with the way the market has made them move forward in terms of affordability and interest cover ratios, but they do want more than the average bank. So I look at it this way: if your portfolio is in shape for 25% of it to go with Lloyd's, it must be in pretty good shape. It's a pretty good test, and if they don't want it, I'd want to find out why they don't want it, and I'd want to maybe fix some of those problems because I think that's well worth looking at. Liquidity wise, it's difficult to say because obviously it's a variable thing. But I'm going to leave it there for this week. Thanks for your kind words, Simon. Thanks. A brilliant question, which I hope quite a few people can benefit from. Enjoyed this week. It was one of those ones for the ages that I know I'm going to be referring back to this supplement quite a few times in the future. Thanks everyone for listening, interacting, taking part. I appreciate the comments. Keep calm and carry on, folks. Cheers.